Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next talk in the operations track. Before I introduce the next talk, please remember to rate the session afterwards. And yeah, I think we will do the introduction. So the next talk is Building the Cloud Native Kernel, Kubernetes Release Engineering by Stephen and Tim. Stephen is an active leader in the Kubernetes community. He currently serves as the product management chair for Kubernetes and chair for both the release and Azure 6. He's also a lead cloud native advocate. So many titles. He's a lead for the cloud native advocacy and tooling at VMware, and Tim Pepper is a senior staff engineer at VMware. It's open source technology and been in open source for the past 20 years. So let's give them all a big round of applause.
Yeah, so that is us. We are both also co-chairs of SIG Release, in addition to Caleb Miles, who works at Pivotal. And this is going to kind of cover some of the high-level philosophy of what we do and why and where it might be going. So to do that well, I want you to pop into a time machine and imagine you're in December of 2017. And what happened back then was it was KubeCon in Austin, and Tim Hockin and Michael Rubin gave a talk titled Kubernetes, Kernels, and Distros. And this was actually the Kubernetes conference where there was a contributor summit and people started talking about breaking the monolith, and this talk went into a little more detail about what a Linux distribution was versus a kernel, some of the benefits of that worldview, how it might be applicable to Kubernetes and the trade-offs, the cost, benefits, risks, and what it might mean were we to change how we build and deliver Kubernetes. So in the meantime, so that was 2 years ago. In the meantime, you might have heard like Kubernetes is the Linux of the cloud. And that's like super easy to say, but what does it mean? Like cloud is pretty fuzzy on its own, right? And like Kubernetes is this pretty big thing also. Like what is it? And Linux, what does that mean? So let's kind of decompose this a little bit. Kubernetes is this big open source project. There's this huge developer community, all sorts of work going around, a relatively monolithic core, and that core is a commodity. We like to say that Kubernetes is boring. And it's also, despite that, it's huge. There's millions of lines of code, and that code can't work just on its own. There's a whole bunch of other components around it that are required to run something. And then all of those things come together in what are called distributions. Distributions are opinionated. Now, what is Linux then? Well, actually, it's a big open source community. It's a big monolithic core. We might call it a kernel. There's also sort of this commodity. We don't talk about, like, do you really know what version of the Linux kernel is on your watch or on your phone or on your server? People don't care. It's a commodity. It's huge. Millions of lines of code there. A whole periphery of other components around it. They come together in opinionated distributions. So it's
similar, right?
Looking maybe similar. Now, it's first day of the conference. I don't want to like totally blow your minds, but maybe this is a mind-blowing comparison.
What's going on?
Let's go. Maybe it could be the Linux of the cloud. But I've still been a little bit cloudy on one point, and I started to allude to it. What is Linux? We can be fuzzy on this. Even all of those of us who've been around for a long time, we might say Linux and be referring to the kernel or some specific Linux distribution or to Linux distributions in general. So a little bit more on what is a distribution. There's a lot more than just a core. Like the core of Kubernetes, the KK, what we call it, github.com/Kubernetes repository. For the Linux kernel, the core is out there on kernel.org. So of course you've got this core. It's something that gets released on a certain cadence relatively quickly, sort of 4 times a year for Kubernetes, roughly 6 a year for Linux. There's this other stuff around it, these other components that I talked about. Those are running on independent release cycles. It could be slower than the core because it's some mature, stable piece of software, or it could be running faster, something where there's a bunch of R&D, innovation happening. Maybe some particular components a little more done, others are a little more raw and moving, but across all these different versions, you get a combinatorial explosion of version possibilities. Then there's also something for a standard library. These things aren't particularly useful in isolation. You want to have communications. You might have some data that you need to persist somewhere, And you actually need to run something, the user's stuff. It's not just running the system itself, but usually there's some other goal in mind. We don't get paid usually just to make a Linux system run or a Kubernetes cluster run. The point of those is to run other user value. You have to have somewhere to run those things, a platform. And you have to have the tooling and frameworks that enable developers to build those interesting things that are going to run. And all of the stuff around system administration, DevOps, SRE, all of those sorts of things that come together.
So hold on, what do we get paid for then?
All the things. There's a whole bunch of moving parts in a Linux distribution, but there's not a lot of value if you look at it just like this. What we want to do is deliver some specific value. There's some content that we're generating. There's something that we're serving. And to do that, you need all of these things to come together, and that's where distributions offer value. They're purpose-built, they're opinionated, there's some particular purpose. And with that, you start to get optimizations. You can focus in on stabilizing certain aspects that are more important to your purpose. So you get one release across all of these components and manage some of that combinatorial effect on dependencies. And you get a coherent, self-consistent assembly. You get that typewriter instead of the 200 typewriter parts. With that, you get a system that's easier to install, easier to do lifecycle management, and that means you can test the thing, you can actually support it. And all of these are really compelling pieces of value, and it's one of the things in open source that is really amazing. You have this aggregator effect, a multiplier effect, and distributions are a key part of that in open source communities. So there's a whole ton of them. You know all the names. Like in Linux, you got the SUSEs, the Red Hats, the Canonicals. Kubernetes, we got the big names. We both happen to work for VMware, but I can guarantee there's Googlers, Microsoft, Amazon folks, others out there watching us talk about this. So there's a ton of distributions, all sorts of unique value, opinionated reasons being generated. Cool. But the benefits of the distros, if we hop back to that talk in 2017, the comparison isn't actually super flattering. We had a very coupled core and non-core components sort of mishmashed together, complicated platform enabling, and the result was incoherent, self-inconsistent assemblies that were difficult to install in lifecycle management, rough edges around testing and support. That's not a fantastic place to be. But in the intervening 2 years, we've had a lot of progress. So today, we actually have over 100 certified conformant Kubernetes offerings across vendors, distributions, hosting services, and installers as well. So what is this conformance? You need to step back a little bit. In the Linux world, in Linux distributions, things are kind of characterized more so by reciprocal licenses in open source. That has a benefit. It means that forking is public and reusable. You can get some synergies there and interesting things happen. In Kubernetes and most of Cloud Native, we're using more permissive licenses, and that comes with the risk of divergent forking. So where Linux didn't necessarily have conformance testing, we need something like that in Kubernetes to make sure that Kubernetes as a word means something, that we can understand what that means. And surprise, we have it. Over the last 2 years, we've made a lot of progress on this front, and that 100+ certifications are there. So we're doing really good on this front, cool, doing good stuff for distros. But there's one other thing that they talked about in the 2017 talk. They kind of imagined 3 possible community futures. Now, they acknowledge that there's going to be other people who make distributions. Okay, but maybe we should think about pulling that back together. Maybe we want to just have one thing that means Kubernetes, or maybe there's some middle ground there. So if you imagine other people are going to make distros, you get this risk of fragmentation or politicization, and thankfully we've evolved conformance, and that's helping a lot with that. Doing good there. One distro to rule them all. In the talk back then in 2017, they said, like, don't do this. This is a fool's errand. It's impossible. And we all agreed. We did not go there. So again, good work on the community, thumbs up, check mark, +1. But find a middle ground. What about that? In the talk, they proposed we really need to do more to clean up the core. We need to work on evolving standards and processes. We need to acknowledge that others are going to do their own, but maybe we could figure out a way to hopefully have them based on ours, still keep a central community concept there, and then have those derived distributions benefit from staying close to this core concept. So how are we doing there? We've actually made a lot of progress. There's improvements in cluster install and management and commonization. We're breaking up the monolith. We're splitting out cloud providers. We've been doing work to adapt how our release cadence works. We have a patch release team now doing support in a slightly different way that's more sustainable in the past. Some interesting discussions about further iterations on that. And then the talk also mentioned back then, we need to really think about community and whether we need different skills and different focuses brought into our community to be more inclusive. So the talk sort of planted that seed, and there's been a lot of really constructive things happening, brainstorming, work underway at this point. So going back to these 3 points, though, around others are going to do their own, and hopefully based on ours, there's one thing I think that's maybe slightly missing, and specifically distro skills and distro focus. There's all of this history in Linux around distros, but it hasn't quite come to the Kubernetes space. And to highlight this, I'm going to go back to this slide showing the pictures on the distributions. I intentionally left something out here. Community distros. And we all know them, the Fedoras, the Arches, the Debians, these other distributions that are out there. And it highlights a distinction. There are community distributions and commercial distributions. And where are our Kubernetes community distributions? Of those 100 conformant offerings, most of them are actually commercial offerings. And even though there are others in there, they're not at the level of an Arch or a CentOS or a Debian or a Fedora in terms of developer community and maturity of the support, the large group of people doing all of the work it takes to make a high-quality, opinionated distro. So on those 3 points, then, what might we have if we were to imagine a community distro for Kubernetes? So implied is that there is going to be a thing to stay close to, a thing to base on, something for a reference implementation. And for lack of a better phrase or word, the way that I'm describing this is like, where is our Debian for Kubernetes? Like that one opinionated, philosophically ideal upstream that is a community place for experimentation and shared collaboration. So let's go look at it. What do we have out there? We've got a bunch of Golang binaries available for download. We've got containers. We've got apt and yum repos. There's a bunch of artifacts, but assembly required. These are at most parts of a distribution. What about our tooling? We've got this deprecated, painful kubeup script. We've got a bunch of other interesting tools, kubeadm, kops, kubespray-kind, for example. But again, these are assembly required. At most, these are tools for building a cluster, not a distribution. Implied within these tools is that there is a distribution, a content that these tools convey to your cluster. Somebody still needs to build that distribution. So I would posit that we're kind of lacking distro build people active in this community, build tools for distros as opposed to components, and then a derivation model and tools around derivation, and more robust dependency management. One of the really useful benefits you see in distros is that they kind of grok all of the dependencies and give you that coherent, opinionated set of things that are going to work together. So like, where is our Kubernetes equivalent of Koji or WannaBuild or Launchpad, if you know those? Where's our equivalent of a Debian PPA or Clear Linux's Mixer tooling? So community distros have an opportunity to present some unique value. Our commercial vendors are trying to differentiate, but if they're all doing the same sort of like, let's all make an installer, is that really what you want your unique value to be? Or is there other more interesting things that you could be doing? Or do you really want to just be the one place where all the bugs are fixed and the community doesn't have that, other vendors don't have it? Or could we get together and are there classes of problems that we could solve in a generic way, do it together, and amortize the cost in development, test, and support? Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Like, we're missing a lot, but we can sort of imagine how we might get there. And there's a lot of interesting work going on to start getting us there. And it's happening in places like our SIG release, also SIG testing, the working group around Kate's infrastructure that's moving our underlying test automation scheme out from Google and into a CNCF and community-run space, and the working group around long-term support that's looking at how we might shift our support model. So that kind of hopefully sets a backdrop for how we've gotten here. And then to get into a little bit more of some specifics, Steven's going to talk about what we're doing around release engineering right now.
Hey, so I guess you thought I was hanging out here just to watch Tim talk. So we've been working over the last few cycles, it's maybe a year and a half now, probably, on building out the idea of a release managers group, right? So this is, we had some of these subsets and characteristic roles within the release team around patch release management and branch management. Really interesting quandary that we had for the patch release managers was that a patch release manager would sign up on the release team, and they would be responsible for maintaining patches for Kubernetes for that minor set until it was out of support, right? So that's about a year, someone signing up to do that work without necessarily being aware of that, right? So we wanted to find a way to make that more, spread that burden. So we built a patch release management team to start. We pulled that out of the release team and made it part of the release engineering sub-project. We had been talking about release engineering for some time, the general idea of it, and had not formed something formal. So that has happened very recently. The branch management role, which is actually the role who cuts the .0 release. So I'm the 117 branch manager. So after this stuff, I'll be pushing a button in a few days. So we took that role too, that was also on the release team, and we moved it, we aligned it with the patch release team. We've also got the build admins. The build admins, as Tim was alluding to, there are a set of things that we have in place today, the apt and yum repos that live in Google land, right? So this project is, the project's inception is from Google. So there are a lot of things that we still do on Google-based infrastructure, right? So our apt and yum repositories, the ability to, our package signing keys are located in Google land as well. So the build admins team is a set of Googlers that have the access and participate in the community to actually cut our packages. Right. And then finally, we have the Release Manager Associates group. Right? So the Release Manager Associates group, if anyone is familiar with the release team, we've got a bunch of release team people here. We've got a bunch of release engineering folks here, all over the place, actually. They were the former branch manager shadows, right? So when did I do it? 2 cycles ago or so? Pulled the... so we do a shadow application towards the end of each of the release cycles. And this time I decided, hey, let's triple the amount of shadows that we're going to have, and let's shift them to the release engineering team instead, right? And give them an opportunity to, so all these tools that we've been kind of alluding to have been there since the project's inception, right? There are scripts that you can check out that have copyright dates of 2016. And they're actually the ones that are responsible for releasing Kubernetes. So we want to get to the point where we can start building, tearing down some of the technical debt that we've built up in the project over time. And I was like, what better way to get involved than by tearing down some of this technical debt, right? Looking at some of these have been really hard problems to solve, and it's essentially the infrastructure that we depend on, and that the community depends on, that vendors depend on to cut Kubernetes. So I think up until now, people have been a little afraid of touching those tools. I'm more of a chaos monkey, so I like to see things break. And I like to understand the process behind them, document that stuff, and kind of build a pathway. So the idea behind building this release managers group was to build essentially an engineering tier, a ladder within the SIG release for the sake of having people similar to Kate's infra that would maintain Kubernetes over time, right? Maintain the build infrastructure, maintain the tooling that's built around that. So I'm really big on, and any presentation you'll see me do, I'm really big on these ideas of people, process, tools, right? We get things done by aligning the right people, putting them in the right room, developing process based on the investigations that they've done over time, and then writing tools based on all of that stuff. We should not be writing tools until we understand the processes and we have the right people to do that, right? So the next piece, right? Establish process. How do we even do that? I'm very slide light, by the way. I like to riff. So we have spent time in the release team, and a lot of the things you'll see if you hang out in SIG release, you'll see lots of see lots of contrasts between what the release engineering group is doing and what the release team is doing. A lot of the things that we've done, both within SIG release as well as across the community, have been based on the way we formed the release team, right? So you can see contributor experience starting to build out role handbooks for some of the things that have, like the issue triage and communications and project management and stuff like that. So that started with SIG release. So we have a set of roles on the release team: the lead, CI signal, enhancements, bug triage, communications, release notes, and I hope I'm not missing one. No, the one I'm missing we got rid of, right? So, am I missing some? No, docs. Oh my God, docs. Sorry, Jim. So what we do with each of those roles is we document them, right? We get an idea of what we think this role is supposed to be doing over the quarter, right, over that cycle of Kubernetes. And we iteratively improve on that documentation across cycles, right? So as we're building these teams, we have a lead role. We bring people up into these shadow roles and hope that they will succeed that lead role for the next cycle. And then those people will eventually become release team leads if they feel like being a master cat herder. That's really what we spend our cycle doing, cat herding, it's super important. So every time that we do this, we pull out something really interesting about the process, and we redocument it. Or someone asks a question and says, like, hey, it's written over here that blah is supposed to happen at this time, and it didn't happen this time. It's like, oh, we don't do it like that anymore, right? And that's actually an avenue for contribution, because like the docs were wrong because we changed the process. But we're open and flexible to changing these processes as the project evolves over time. So we've been doing that on the release team side, and we started building out very similar handbooks for the release managers group, right? So the patch release team, the build admins, and the branch managers, right? So essentially, this kind of all kicks off with the branch management group. The branch management group has a tight feedback loop between them and the release team. So they're responsible for cutting all of the pre-releases of Kubernetes. We actually cut a 117 beta 2 on Monday, just as we're kicking off KubeCon. So essentially they hang out in the release in the release team meetings, get an understanding of how the cycle is pacing. This gets really important as we're actually moving into that part this Friday. We're going to be cutting our first RC for 117, so we're getting close to the line. It's really important that we're watching CI signal and different things like that. But as we're building out these processes, we get a more of a clearer picture about what these tools look like, right? So the tools that we've been working on, actually, and some of the release manager associates who are in the room have been working on them with me. We want to find a way to rip and replace the existing tool set, right? So Kubernetes is released by a tool called Anago. Anago is an 1848-line bash script that imports 3 libraries: a common library, a Git library, and a release library that each are at least 500 lines of shell code as well. So it's time to not do that anymore. I think that we can, so we're starting to move to more robust languages like Go, cough, cough. Anybody familiar with Go? Yeah. So starting to rewrite that. I've actually got some of the people in the room who are rewriting those tools right now with me. So the first one that we did, we'll actually give you a super deep dive of all of these tools tomorrow. Hannes and I are going to be doing a release engineering deep dive. But the first one we did was rewriting branch fast forward. So branch fast forward is a little utility that moves the release branch from basically fast forwards master onto the release branch, right? And runs some scripts to make sure that versions are in check, drops some change logs, and so on and so forth. So we've done that. We're doing push build. Push build is responsible for pushing all of the Kubernetes builds up to our GCS, our Google Cloud Storage buckets. So we're starting to rewrite that one next. But overall, I had this idea. I was like, what if we had this kind of toolbox, right? And I was trying to find a cooler name, but I came up with Krell, Kubernetes release toolbox. So that's what we've been doing. Essentially, all of these tools that have been singular shell scripts are coming into this toolbox as subcommands, right? So we're using Cobra and Viper and all that good stuff. And then the second one myself and the team have been working on is Kube package, right? So the apt and yum repositories that we were talking about before, we want there to be a dead simple way to produce debs and RPMs for Kubernetes. We also want to try to build this stuff in a way. We actually got the question, I think it was Sasha who asked the question, or maybe it was you, Hannes, about, well, why don't we put the deb and RPM stuff inside of Krell, right? And I think it's a better idea to have this separate because this is a more generally useful tool. We're starting to move to the point where I think a lot of companies internally have built their own tools around community-based things because we didn't have anything that was good before, right? So we're trying to kind of flip that story, change the narrative, and build tools that are actually useful for not just the community, but for vendors, for hobbyists to consume as well. So there's still quite a bit of work to do, but we're starting to coalesce a team, processes for that team, and tools around that effort. And I encourage anyone who's in the room who's interested in getting involved. It looks scary. It looks scary at first. Promise it's not scary. Promise we're super friendly people. We have lots of meetings to go to. Two on Mondays alternating. We'll do the SIG release and then the release team meeting on Mondays, and then alternating weeks we'll do the release engineering meeting and the release team meeting back to back. So everyone who is in this crowd, everyone who's looking at this video later, please come hang out with us. Help us write the future of this Kubernetes distro. And thank you to the people who have already started on that work and have spent the last few cycles. I love to see all of them in the room. I think it's been a kind of a year and a half that we've really been cranking on this stuff, and we're starting to see some benefit out of all of the investigation that we've been doing, mapping tools, finding, doing investigation on things that we don't really have access to sometimes, right? So like digging into the outlines of a Google repository and realizing that we as SIG chairs didn't have access to push Kubernetes or have access to like the release and testing GCP projects. So it's been a fun journey to get here, but I think we're finally in a place where we can start to build this idea of like what Kubernetes, the distro, is. So do you have closing remarks? Or we want to open it up to questions? Yeah?
I think you summarized it well. Like we spent a lot of time investigating, understanding where we are. We have a vision for where we could be in the future, and we're starting to get in and make incremental changes because this is a big complex system and project, and we can't just throw away our existing system and replace it with something else in a kind of a monolithic transition. We're trying to do it deliberately and piecemeal, incrementally, and prove that each incremental change is a useful tool on its own, effectively replaces a prior one, and maintains or improves the current state of the art. So it's a lot of opportunity. We'd love to have help.
Cool. Questions?
So are there plans to move off of the Google infrastructure?
Yes. So I should have gone a little deeper into the rip and replace part. So starting in 1.18, I think we can do it in 1.18. Let's start at 1.18, why not? So I've been working on some of basically mocking the flow of a Kubernetes build, Kubernetes stage, and Kubernetes release process, shifting that so it's kind of still Google infrastructure because we're running on GCP, but it is no longer Google-owned projects, right? So the CNCF-sponsored GCP projects are the ones that we'll be moving to. So we know that the build process works. It's running in CI right now. I'm almost done with the staging bits. And then I think we're going to figure out, we're going to build an idea of promotion, right? So being able to land something in staging, have it run, have it pass a suite of tests, and then promote directly into prod or near prod. I think one of the hugest advantages that we'll get out of that, having something that's closer to automated, is what we don't have today is if anyone has ever installed Kubernetes and done it via package manager, on the Debian side, you'll notice that you have to add a repo called Kubernetes Xennial to your lists, right? And that repo actually contains all of the packages for Debian. It is not just for Xennial. It is poorly named, and it's caused us to be a little less flexible about what we can do in terms of offering, say, nightly packages. Right? We can't do that today. So we're working on building new apt and yum repos in the CNCF infrastructure, working on this promotion flow. Once that lands, we'll have a release stream, we'll have a testing stream, and a nightly stream, right? So all of the pre-releases will land in that testing stream. All of the releases will land in the release stream, and all of the nightly ones will push at least one a day. Maybe we can do 2 a day, but. Yeah.
And the folks who are working on this are coordinating the core of that. So and maybe to step back a piece, right now we have a lot of things that run on GCP that are run by Googlers who have access to special projects with access controls, and that's a completely private thing. And Google's wanted to open this up to the community almost a year and a half ago at the Open Source Summit North America last year in Vancouver. They pledged, I think it was $9 million to the CNCF in terms of tokens. So the idea is if we're all paying the CNCF together, like any company could do similarly, and maybe we have it's not just GCP even underneath, but we fund a neutral place that chooses how, as a community, to do vendor independent, or more so vendor independent deployments to interesting places where we get test feedback, and that we're the ones running them. We have the access controls, we have the auditability, we make sure that we're doing all of that professionally and not just riding on the shirt tails of our Uncle Google, who's been super generous to us. But they don't necessarily want to have to maintain this stuff. They want help. We get benefits by working together as a community. The other interesting thing there is that as we start looking at it, there's some common patterns. So Stephen mentioned this idea of promotion. It's a kind of normal thing out there. You have a nightly branch where your automated builds are going, and the ones that pass CI get promoted to testing, and people who dare will test that much more than nightly. And at some point, we bless a particular one of those and say it is the release. So you promote across these streams. And we now have a generic image promotion tool for doing this with containers. And this is another one of the edge cases that's typically a Googleism right now, not just the package creation of the releases, but any of the containers that are part of the broader distribution. We rely on a Googler who has the rights to build and push that to the special GCR repo. So all of these things as a community, we need to come together to better operationalize.
It might be a little off topic, but I was wondering, where do things like K3s fit into this, or sort of the, fringe stuff, to be honest, right now?
So K3S, or however you pronounce it,
Oh, I don't know how to pronounce it. I've only read it.
They have conformance results uploaded. They were conformant, I think, for 1.13 and 14 Kubernetes.
So, yeah.
You could consider them a conformant distribution of Kubernetes. Are they a community one? I mean, in a way, it feels like I build the cloud K3S on GitHub, but it's also Rancher. Is it a vendor distro? I don't know. But it's an interesting example of the variation that you get and the potential for innovation, I think. I think also one other thing on K3S, I kind of find it quite intriguing because they're an example of how far you could push to declare some of the boundaries of the kernel if you want to go that way, and do it in a radical way as a proof of concept to show the possibilities.
I think that tools like that make it. We open quite a bit of possibilities for so I'm a former field engineer at some cloud native companies, and it's interesting to see when you have use cases like for the edge, right, where distributions that are kind of more tightly bound start to fit those really nicely, right? So is that something that we'll look at as a community potentially, right? But it's like, I think we need to get our house in order in terms of like what we have today before we start stretching those boundaries.
Quick question, and maybe this is already the case, so forgive me if I'm asking a silly question, but is there a higher level CDF for sort of shared release engineering efforts? You know, a common, like same way an organization tries to centralize pipelines or to provide common support to multiple instead of every project having the entire effort to do that. Is that concept ever surfaced? It's like in a large company, right? The economies of scale, right? You have 50, 100 teams. You don't want all of them create their own builds and pipelines. You want at some point some scaling of that.
You're starting to see that. I think if you look at SIG Cloud Provider, which didn't used to exist, there was SIG GCP, there was SIG IBM, there was SIG VMware. Now there's SIG Cloud Provider, and the others are sub-projects under it. If you look at the working group LTS, we've got folks active there from VMware, from Red Hat, from Google, from SUSE. We had interest from Canonical. We had interest from a couple of very large vendors in China who recognize that there's a benefit in amortizing the patch release process so that everybody's not independently cherry picking. We have a core set of the most skilled engineers doing it once correctly from a security patch perspective. So there's a lot of things like that. At the same time, we don't want to go too far that direction because we do want all of these different pieces to be able to run at their own release rates and be free to innovate and not be tied to the schedule of the kernel. Yeah, so examples like the image promoter, and I think some of the other things that we're working on pulling out of the giant 3,000+ monolithic lines of bash. As we do that, they become more usable, and people are interested because they have something similar and are starting to wonder if we could find a pattern there and build something for a common tool.
Yeah, so this is definitely more of the, I would not ask you to run the thing that I'm writing today, but we're getting to the point where these are tools and common patterns that can be used both on the community side as well as internally for companies, right? So this is, we're probably a year out at least. So
yeah, unfortunately we are out of time. So let's give Tim and Stephen a big round of applause.